Walt Grayson had lived in the Wyoming wilderness for decades. Long enough for the seasons to become his only real measure of time. Once a hunter and park ranger, now over 70, he spent his days in quiet solitude, tending to his cabin, chopping wood, and keeping an eye on the land that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. His wife, Margaret, had passed away nearly 10 years ago, and their children had long since left for the city, chasing careers and families of their own. Walt didn't blame them. He had always known that the life he chose wasn't for everyone. The wind howled through the towering pines, shaking the cabin walls as if to remind him that winter was coming early this year. He had spent the last few weeks gathering enough firewood to last until spring, checking the roof for leaks, and reinforcing the small barn where he kept his mule, Daisy. Food was plentiful. His pantry was stocked with canned goods, dried meat, and jars of preserves he had put away during the summer. He had even traded with a local rancher for fresh supplies in early October, knowing that once the snows came, he'd be completely cut off from the outside world. That was how he preferred it. Each morning, he took a walk down to the creek that ran behind the cabin, listening to the sound of the water moving beneath the thin layer of ice forming along the banks. He would check for animal tracks, watch for signs of a storm, and take in the stillness of the wilderness. It was a quiet life, but it was his life. Then, everything changed. It was just after sunset when Walt first heard the sound. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of the trees. But then it became clearer. A voice. A human voice. He hadn't had visitors in years. Most people didn't come this deep into the wilderness unless they were lost or desperate. He grabbed his rifle out of habit, not expecting trouble but knowing better than to be unprepared. Stepping out onto the porch, he scanned the tree line. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. Then he saw it, a figure stumbling through the trees, bundled in layers of clothing but clearly struggling. Help. The voice was weak, barely carrying over the wind. Walt didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, his boots crunching against the frozen ground as he approached the stranger. It was a young man, no older than 30, his face pale from the cold, eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Easy now, Walt said, steadying him as he nearly collapsed. Let's get you inside. The man was half frozen, his clothes soaked from what must have been a fall through thin ice or an unexpected storm. Walt guided him to the cabin, setting him near the fireplace, where the heat quickly began to bring color back to his cheeks. Name's Walt, he said gruffly, pouring a cup of hot tea and placing it into the stranger's shaking hands. You got a name? Daniel, the man managed between shivers. Daniel Carter. Walt studied him, noting the expensive hiking gear that had done little to protect him from the brutal elements. You get lost? He asked. Daniel nodded. I was hiking. Thought I could make it to the next town before nightfall. But the snow came in fast. I lost the trail. I didn't think I was going to make it. Walt sighed. He had seen it before. City folk thinking they could handle the wild, underestimating how quickly things could go wrong. You're lucky, he muttered. Another hour out there, and you'd be part of the landscape. For the next few days, Daniel recovered, slowly regaining his strength. Walt wasn't used to company, but the kid wasn't much trouble. He asked questions, lots of them, about how Walt lived out here, what it was like to be alone for so long. Walt answered when he felt like it, but mostly he let the silence do the talking. One night, as the fire crackled between them, Daniel spoke. You ever get lonely? Walt thought about it. Loneliness was a strange thing. It had crept up on him after Margaret died, after the kids stopped visiting. At first, he had fought it, but over time, he had accepted it, made peace with it. Not the way you mean. He finally said, I miss people, sure, but out here, you learn to be alone without being lonely. Daniel nodded but said nothing more. A few days later, the storm cleared, and the young man was strong enough to leave. Walt gave him directions, pointed him toward the nearest town, and even packed him some food for the journey. Daniel thanked him, shook his hand, and disappeared down the trail. Walt watched him go, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, an odd sense of connection. However brief, maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone in this world as he had come to believe. The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, covering the ground in a soft, white blanket. Walt had been chopping wood all afternoon, stacking it neatly against the side of his cabin, knowing that the winter had settled in for good. He had just finished piling the last few logs when he heard it, a faint, pitiful sound, almost lost in the wind. It wasn't the usual call of a bird or the distant howl of a wolf. It was something smaller, weaker, a cry of desperation. He paused, listening. The sound came again, just beyond the tree line where the land dipped into a shallow ravine. Walt pulled his coat tighter around him and grabbed his rifle, not out of fear but out of habit. In the wilderness, it was never wise to go unarmed. He moved cautiously through the snow, his boots crunching beneath him, eyes scanning the landscape for movement. And then he saw it. A small, trembling shape huddled against the base of a pine tree, half buried in the snow. At first, he thought it might be a stray dog. But as he got closer, he recognized the unmistakable features: a bear cub. The little creature was barely moving, its fur matted with ice, ribs faintly visible beneath its thick coat. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. Far too young to be on its own. Walt knelt beside it, scanning the area for any sign of the mother. There were no tracks, no disturbances in the snow that indicated a larger bear had been nearby. He knew what that meant. Either the mother had abandoned it, too weak to care for another mouth, or worse, she had been killed. The cub lifted its head slightly, blinking at him with wide, frightened eyes. Walt had seen a lot of things in his years living out here. But something about the way that little bear looked at him, helpless, lost, made his chest tighten. He knew the risks. Bears were not pets. They were wild animals, unpredictable and dangerous. But this one wouldn't survive the night. Not alone. And so, against his better judgment, Walt made his decision. Well, Boone, he muttered, the name coming to him without much thought. After the great explorer Daniel Boone. Looks like you're coming with me. Carefully, he slipped off his thick coat and wrapped it around the cub, lifting it with more ease than he expected. The little bear was lighter than he should have been, a sign that it had gone without food for too long. Boone let out a soft whimper but didn't resist. Too weak to protest, Walt carried him back to the cabin, pushing open the door with his shoulder and stepping inside. The warmth of the fire immediately wrapped around them, melting the ice from his boots and filling the room with the scent of burning pine. He set Boone down near the hearth, unwrapping him from the coat and rubbing his fur gently to help circulate warmth back into his tiny body. For a long while, Boone didn't move. Walt sat down in his old chair, watching, waiting. The cub's breathing was slow but steady. Eventually, he stirred, lifting his head slightly, sniffing at the air. Walt rummaged through his stores, trying to think of what a bear cub could eat. He found a bit of milk, warmed it over the fire, and poured it into a shallow dish. Boone hesitated at first but soon lapped it up greedily. That's it, kid, Walt murmured. Gotta get your strength back. The first night was rough. Boone whimpered in his sleep, shifting restlessly. Walt knew it wasn't fear of the cabin. It was the loss of his mother. Even animals grieved. Walt had seen it in wolves, in deer, in birds that mated for life. He understood it all too well. Over the next few days, Boone grew stronger. He was still wary, keeping his distance at first. But hunger had a way of breaking down walls. Walt fed him scraps of fish, bits of berries he had stored away. And slowly, the little bear came around. He would watch Walt with those curious eyes, following him from across the room, always keeping just enough space between them to remind both of them that he was still a wild thing. By the end of the week, Boone had decided the cabin was home. At least for now. He would curl up near the fire at night, his small body rising and falling with steady breaths. During the day, he would clumsily explore, nosing at Walt's boots, pawing at the wooden floor with a kind of innocent fascination. "You ain't gonna stay small forever," Walt said one evening, watching as Boone tried, and failed, to climb onto the cot. "One day, you'll be big enough to break down this whole damn cabin if you wanted to." But for now, Boone was just a cub, growing stronger with each passing day. Walt knew it couldn't last. Bears didn't belong in cabins. He would have to let Boone go before he became too attached. Before Boone became too dependent. That was the way of things. Still, as he sat by the fire, sipping his coffee while Boone lay curled up beside the hearth, he let himself enjoy the moment. After all these years of solitude, of listening only to the wind and the river, the presence of another living creature, one that relied on him, if only for now, was something he hadn't realized he needed. "Guess we'll figure it out, Boone," Walt muttered, reaching down to ruffle the cub's thickening fur, one day at a time. At first, Boone was wary. Even as Walt fed him warm milk and soft bits of food. Even as he let him rest by the fire, the little bear would watch him with those round, cautious eyes. Wild animals didn't trust easily. And Boone had already learned that the world could be cruel. Walt didn't push him. He simply did what needed to be done, keeping him warm, making sure he ate, and giving him space when he needed it. Trust was something that had to be earned. And Walt had all the time in the world. The first few nights, Boone whimpered in his sleep, shifting and twitching as if dreaming of something he had lost. Walt understood that grief, the way it settled into your bones and never quite left. But each morning, Boone woke up a little stronger. He would lift his head, sniff the air, and watch as Walt moved about the cabin. Slowly, his body filled out. His ribs weren't so visible anymore, and his fur took on a healthier sheen. One evening, as Walt sat in his chair reading by lantern light, Boone did something unexpected. He wandered over, sniffed at Walt's boots, and then, after a long moment of hesitation, curled up right at his feet. Walt didn't say anything, just let the moment settle. But a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Boone was starting to trust him. As the days passed, Boone grew bolder. At first, he would only venture a few steps away from the cabin. But then he began following Walt when he went to chop wood or check his traps. He was clumsy, his paws too big for his small body, often tumbling over himself as he tried to navigate the snowy terrain. Walt couldn't help but chuckle when Boone tumbled face first into a snowbank, emerging with an indignant snort before shaking himself off. "Gotta work on that balance, kid," Walt muttered, ruffling the fur between the cub's ears. Boone let out a soft, grumbling sound in response, almost as if he understood. By the time spring started to creep into the Wyoming wilderness, Boone had grown considerably. He was no longer the fragile cub Walt had found in the snow. His legs were sturdier, his steps more confident. He still followed Walt everywhere, padding alongside him through the woods as if he were just another companion on the journey. When Walt fished by the river, Boone would sit nearby, watching the water with an intense curiosity. Sometimes, he would swat at the surface, sending ripples through the stream and scaring off the fish before Walt could even get a bite. "Damn it, Boone," Walt grumbled after the third time it happened, though there was no real anger in his voice. "If you're gonna sit there, at least don't spook my dinner." Boone tilted his head, then swiped at the water again, this time actually managing to slap a fish onto the shore. He looked at it, then up at Walt, as if expecting approval. Walt laughed. "Well, I'll be damned. Guess you're good for something after all." Fishing trips became a routine. Boone learned to wait until Walt gave him the signal. Then he would help catch fish by swiping them onto the riverbank. It wasn't the most efficient way to fish, but it worked. Boone also found other ways to make himself useful. When Walt hauled logs back to the cabin for firewood, Boone would grab smaller branches in his mouth and trot alongside him, dropping them onto the growing pile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Walt shake his head in amusement. "You ain't a dog, you know," he muttered one afternoon as Boone proudly deposited another branch at his feet. "But I guess we all gotta find ways to be useful." Boone was growing fast. Walt knew it was only a matter of time before he would be too big to live in the cabin, too wild to stay. Bears didn't belong with people. They belonged in the forests, in the rivers, in the open spaces where they could roam free. And yet, as Boone curled up beside the fireplace at night, as he followed Walt through the woods with an unwavering loyalty, it was hard to imagine the day when they would have to part ways. One evening, as Walt sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the pines, Boone climbed up beside him, settling down with a deep huff. Walt reached out and scratched behind his ears, the way he had done since Boone was small. "You're gonna be big soon," Walt murmured. "Bigger than this cabin, bigger than me. One day, you're gonna have to go. That's the way of things." Boone didn't answer. Of course. But he leaned into Walt's touch, letting out a contented rumble. Walt sighed, staring out at the trees, the mountains beyond. He had lived a long time, seen many things, lost more than he cared to remember. But in all his years, he had never had a companion quite like Boone. For now, at least, they still had time, and that was enough. Boone grew fast, faster than Walt had expected. The small, shivering cub he had once carried into his cabin was now a powerful, full-grown bear. His paws, once clumsy and oversized, now moved with confidence, his thick coat gleaming in the summer sun. Boone had become a force of nature. Yet despite his strength, he remained gentle in Walt's presence. He still followed him to the river, still helped drag firewood back to the cabin, and still lay beside the porch in the evenings, watching the sky turn red and gold with the sunset. But not everyone saw Boone the way Walt did. The nearest town was a good 20 miles away, but word traveled fast in these parts. Hunters, trappers, and ranchers who passed through had caught sight of Boone trailing behind Walt or lounging near the cabin. Concern grew. People murmured about the dangers of keeping a wild bear so close. Warnings spread like wildfire. One afternoon, a man named Henry Tate, an old acquaintance of Walt's, rode up to the cabin and dismounted his horse with a grim expression. "You know this can't last, Walt," Henry said, brushing the dust from his coat. "A bear's a bear, might seem tame now, but instincts don't just disappear. One day, something's gonna set him off, and someone's gonna get hurt." Walt listened but said nothing. He had heard it before, from others in town, from passing hunters who warned him that Boone would turn, that it wasn't a matter of if, but when. Walt didn't argue. He had lived long enough to know that men only believed what they wanted to. But that night, as he sat on the porch with Boone resting beside him, he couldn't shake Henry's words. Boone had never given him reason to fear him. He had never shown aggression, never bared his teeth in anything but play. Yet deep down, Walt knew the truth. Boone was not a pet. He was not a companion in the way a dog might be. He was a creature of the wild, and the wild had a way of calling its own home. Then, one summer morning, Boone disappeared. Walt woke as he always did, expecting to find Boone stretched out near the cabin. But he was gone. His usual tracks weren't there. No sign that he had wandered to the river or the woods nearby. Walt searched, calling his name as he moved through the trees. But there was only silence. A hollow feeling settled in his chest, a mix of worry and understanding. Boone was a bear, after all. Maybe this was what was meant to happen. 3 days passed. Walt had convinced himself that Boone was gone for good, that he had finally answered the call of the wild. And then, on the 4th day, just as the sun was sinking below the trees, Boone came back. Walt was stacking wood when he heard the heavy crunch of paws on gravel. He turned, and there Boone was, standing at the edge of the clearing, his fur dusted with leaves, his massive body moving with the confidence of something that had roamed far and free. But his eyes still held recognition. "Well, look who decided to come home," Walt muttered, though he wasn't sure if he meant it as a joke or something else. Boone huffed, loping forward, nudging his massive head against Walt's shoulder as if nothing had changed. But something had. Boone had been out there, in the world where he belonged. And yet he had come back. It wasn't fear that had driven him home. It wasn't hunger. He had chosen to return. That night, as Boone settled by the fire like he had so many times before, Walt sat in his chair, staring at the embers and thinking. He knew, deep down, that this was only temporary. Boone had come back this time. But one day, he wouldn't. One day, the pull of the wild would be stronger than the bond they shared. And when that day came, Walt would have to let him go. It was a thought that sat heavy in his chest. But he didn't fight it. Instead, he reached out, running a weathered hand through Boone's thick fur. "You're getting too big for this place," he said quietly. "One day, you won't need me anymore." Boone let out a low rumbling sound, something between a sigh and a contented growl. Walt wasn't sure if he understood. But maybe understanding wasn't the point. Maybe it was enough to just be here. For now. And so they sat, a man and his bear, in the fading glow of the fire, knowing that time was slipping away, but not quite ready to say goodbye. The winter came early that year, sweeping across the Wyoming wilderness with heavy snows and biting winds. Walt felt the cold more than he used to. His bones ached, his steps grew slower, and the simple tasks that had once been second nature took more effort than before. He wasn't a young man anymore. And he knew it. The fire in his cabin burned longer these days. And he spent more time inside, watching the snow fall through the frost-covered windows. Boone, now a full-grown grizzly, still lingered nearby, though something had changed. Walt could see it in the way Boone moved. In the way he would stop and listen to sounds Walt couldn't hear. Sniff the wind as if searching for something. The wild was calling. Walt had always known this day would come. It was inevitable. Boone wasn't meant for this life. He was meant for the deep forests, the wide rivers, the mountains where the sky stretched endlessly above. But knowing something is inevitable doesn't make it easier when it happens. One night, the cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire, and Walt sat in his chair, wrapped in an old wool blanket, staring into the flames. Boone lay near the door, massive and still, but his ears twitched at every sound beyond the walls. Then, something changed. Boone lifted his head sharply, his great body tensing. A sound, distant but clear, echoed through the trees, a deep, resonant call. Another bear. Walt watched as Boone rose to his feet, shifting his weight, uncertain. He turned to look at Walt, hesitation in his dark eyes. There was a moment, just a moment, where Walt saw the cub he had rescued so many winters ago. Small and shivering in the snow. But that cub was gone. Before him now stood a powerful, wild creature, caught between two worlds. Walt took a slow breath and nodded. "Go on, Boone," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's time." Boone stood there for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on Walt as if memorizing him, as if saying goodbye in the only way he knew how. Then, with a final huff, he turned and pushed through the door into the night. Walt followed onto the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. The wind howled, carrying Boone's heavy footprints away as fast as he made them. Walt watched as the massive bear disappeared into the darkness, his form blending with the trees, swallowed by the wilderness that had always been his true home. He didn't call him back. He wouldn't. Boone never returned. But Walt knew he was out there. Every winter, when the first snows came, he would find tracks near the cabin, large, unmistakable prints in the fresh powder. Sometimes, they circled the house. Other times, they led to the river where they lingered near the banks. It was never more than that, never a visit, never a sighting, just footprints. Just a quiet reminder that Boone hadn't forgotten. The years passed, and Walt grew older. The winters seemed longer, the summers shorter. He moved slower now, but he still did what he could, chopping wood, fishing at the river when the weather allowed, sitting on the porch with a blanket over his lap, listening to the world grow quiet around him. And then, one winter morning, he didn't wake up. The people from town came days later, concerned when he hadn't made his usual trip for supplies before the deep snows set in. They found him in his chair, peaceful, as if he had simply drifted away in his sleep. There was no struggle, no sign of distress, just the quiet passing of a man who had lived his life the way he had wanted to, on his own terms, in his own time. But it was what they found outside that truly left them speechless. Dotted around the cabin were the same massive footprints that had appeared every winter, as if something large had come and gone in the night. And near the simple grave they made for Walt, beneath the great pine tree where he had spent so many evenings watching the sunset, there were deep claw marks gouged into the bark. Not random, not the careless scratches of a passing bear. Deliberate, marked, as if something had come back. One last time. The people who found the tracks whispered about it for years. About the old man who had tamed a bear. About the bond that had never truly been broken. Some called it a coincidence. Others weren't so sure, but those who had known Walt, who had seen Boone with their own eyes, believed. And when the snows fell, blanketing the land in silence once more, the footprints came again.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.